Again, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Rumi Forum. My name is Jenna Ledke. I direct intercultural and interfaith affairs at the Rumi Forum. And I'm very pleased to introduce, as I've been following this gentleman's work for a long time, and I'm pleased to introduce him today as he's going to speak with us here at the Rumi Forum. Dr. Jones is the CEO of Public Religion Research Institute, otherwise known as PRRI, as many of you probably know, and a leading scholar and commentator on religion, values in public life. He is the author of 2 academic books and numerous peer-review articles on religion and public policy. His latest book, and look for it in July 2016, it's titled The End of White Christian America, and again, published by Simon & Schuster, July 2016. Hopefully we can have him back for a book talk. Additionally, Dr. Jones writes a monthly column at The Atlantic, also very good to watch out for on those. On politics and culture, his, quote, Faith by the Numbers segment is also a regular feature on the Interfaith Voices, the nation's leading religion news magazine, which is carried on NPR stations around the country. Dr. Jones serves as the co-chair of the National Steering Committee for the Religion and Politics section of the American Academy of Religion, and is a member of the editorial board for Politics and Religion, a journal published by Cambridge University Press for the American Political Science Association. He holds a PhD from Emory University's Graduate Division of Religion. Your theme here, religion. Big topic these days, which named him Distinguished Alumnus of the Year in 2013. He also holds a Master of Divinity from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. And he's going to speak with us today on public opinion, trends of public opinion, and the changing religious demographic landscape in America. So please welcome him.
Well, thanks for coming, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to try to talk about 15 minutes or so, maybe a little longer than that, and then leave a lot of time for kind of discussion. As you know, there's a lot happening at this intersection of religion and politics in this campaign season in the American context. So I'm going to be just a little bit about the sources you'll see. So there'll be a lot of numbers flying around. I'll be happy to make, I have a kind of PowerPoint presentation that this comes from, but I'm happy to make that available to distribute afterward. That way you don't have to worry too much about scribbling down a bunch of numbers as we go. And also what I'm going to try to do is not overwhelm you with numbers, but try to kind of use them to tell a story, right? And think about a big pattern here. I'll start with the name of the book. So I have a book coming out July 12th. It's called The End of White Christian America. Now, that sounds like a fairly political title. It's meant to be provocative, but it is a data-driven book that really is telling the story of demographic and cultural change in the United States, particularly over the last few decades. And we're drawing on more than 150,000 interviews with Americans that we at PRI have conducted over the last 5 years, plus about 3 decades of data from the General Social Survey, which is one of the most widely respected sources of data on kind of American society and politics and demographics in the country. So I'm going to try to tell you a story that really is looking at the last few decades, what's relevant, I think, for today's politics. So I'm going to start with some things about changes in religious affiliation in the U.S. As you know, I think everyone who's been here for any time has some sense that things are shifting in the U.S., but I think when you actually see the numbers, they're quite astonishing, particularly what has happened since the 1990s forward. So it's really since the 90s where the changes really have accelerated. So just give you a couple numbers. So we start back in the 1970s, and the General Social Survey goes back to the early 1970s. 1974, the country was 63% Protestant, right? So just Protestant, not counting Catholics, just Protestants, 63%. Today that number is 46%. So we're no longer a majority Protestant country. Look at this in other ways. Also, even if you look within the world of Protestantism, it has changed quite significantly. Back again in the early 1970s, we were still a majority white Protestant country. So not just Protestant, but white and Protestant. So if you think about this kind of mythology of America being a kind of waspy country, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country, that was largely demographically true, at least in terms of if you were looking at majorities in the early 1970s. 1993, was the last year that the country was a majority white and Protestant. Right? Since then, it's been on decline. Today, that number is 35% white and Protestant. So big changes again since the early 90s. But it's not just a Protestant story. These changes have really been true of Catholics as well. So Catholics, what's a little mystifying about, if you look at the Catholic population in the U.S., though, is that if you just look at the top, at the surface, it looks fairly stable. So if you go back again, early 70s, early 90s, Catholics made up about a quarter of the U.S. population. That's roughly true today. They've slipped a little bit, but still between 20 and 25%, depending on the survey you look at. But that hides a massive changes that are happening underneath the surface. The biggest thing to say here is that in the early 70s, all the way through the early 90s, the ratio of white to non-white Catholics was about 10 to 1. Today, it is almost 1 to 1, white to non-white Catholics in the country. That's been largely due to attrition, aging and death among older white Catholics, and non-replacement, or disaffiliation among younger white Catholics. As that plus immigration have been the driving engines of change here. So again, today we're looking at almost as many non-white Catholics as we have white Catholics. There's a number of states, particularly in the West and Southwest, where there's majority Latino Catholics in the country. So that's a new thing in the American context. And so in fact, if you look at what Catholicism looks like in, say, California or New Mexico versus what it looks like in Pennsylvania or Massachusetts, they look very, very different, in terms of the composition style. So the other thing to say is that so that's kind of Catholics and Protestants, but if you put like all white Christians together and think about kind of white Christianity as in this kind of the title, kind of the cue to the title of the book, together, what we see is those changes have happened also fairly quickly. And if we look just at this point in time when Barack Obama was running for president in 2008, is a good comparison point. Still, if you take all white Christians together, Catholics, Protestants, non-denominational people, everyone who's white, non-Hispanic, and Christian, even if we go just back to 2008, 54% of the country was white and Christian. So majority still white and Christian. That number today, just during Barack Obama's tenure, has dropped to 45%. Right? So we're seeing this kind of shift, a kind of tipping point that has reached from a majority white and Christian country to a minority white and Christian country just across President Obama's tenure as president. And that's a kind of remarkable thing when you think about the kind of composition of the country. And typically we don't see demographic changes happening quite that quickly. And again, the engines here are differential birth rates between white and non-white Americans, immigration, particularly Latino immigration into the country. And then the other one is disaffiliation of both white and Protestant and Catholics, younger people not affiliating. And just to give you one quick number on this, if we look at seniors in the country, only about those age 65 and years of age or older, only about 1 in 10 seniors claim no religious affiliation in the country. But if we look among younger Americans, that is 18 to 29-year-olds in America, 36% of them claim no religious affiliation at all in public opinion surveys. So more than 3 times the number of seniors. So that's a real sea change. In terms of, and if you also look at the kind of white Christian number, nearly 7 in 10 seniors are white and Christian. You take that number down to millennials, it's only a quarter of millennials are white and Christian. So this generational change, you can just see it over the course of the generations that are actually alive right now. You can see this change. So these changes have been kind of real, and they've been fairly quick. They've also sort of changed, I think, the way people think about what the kind of relationship between what has been America's dominant religion, Christianity, and what it means to be an American. So we had a kind of interesting question that we asked about back this past July. How important is being Christian for being truly American? Is it somewhat important? Is it very important, somewhat important, not too important, not at all important? Among seniors, 54% of seniors say it is very important for being American, and another 21% say it's somewhat important. When you go to millennials, they only 19% of millennials say that this is very important, right? And only another 16%. So you say it's somewhat important. So even if you take the somewhat important, you're only at about a third of millennials saying this is important. So again, kind of the way of thinking about what it means to be an American, and the relationship of religion to that identity is something that is just a generational chasm in the country today, and it's part of what's fueling also partisan politics and how that's playing out. I'll say a little bit more about that in a bit. The other thing I want to just kind of bring up in terms of thinking about, we did a big, every fall we do, in partnership with the Brookings Institution, this survey called the American Values Survey. It's a large, nationally representative survey. We cover a lot of topics. And last fall, we were really struck, even before the primary season got kicked off, at how pessimistic that the American electorate was across the board. Kind of whether you're talking about economic things, or you're talking about outlook on the future, whether this generation was going to be better, the new generation was going to be better off than their parents, like all those kinds of questions. Fairly pessimistic thing, and I think that's relevant to kind of some of the tensions and anxieties we're seeing in the electorate. Just a couple of examples here. Even though economists have been telling us for some time now that the recession is over, that we have low unemployment, no bunch of other macro indicators seem very good, when we ask average Americans whether they think the U.S. is still in a recession, in 2012 we asked this question, 3/4 said yes, the U.S. is still in a recession. 2014, we asked this question again. 72% of Americans say, yes, we're still in a recession. We asked this again last fall, 2015, 72%, yes, we're still in a recession, right? So it just has not sunk in to Americans that are still being hit pretty hard. The other thing, that kind of basic indicator, we've been tracking questions around the American dream, and we define that by if you work hard, you'll get ahead. Very simple, kind of basic American, upward mobility principle. Americans have actually become fairly pessimistic. In fact, now more Americans than not say that the American dream once held true, but it doesn't anymore. So 48%, nearly half of the country says it once held true, it doesn't anymore. 42% say that the American dream still holds true. And if you look at white working class Americans, where there's been a lot of attention so far, 56% of white working class Americans say it once held true, but it doesn't anymore. So a lot of economic pessimism, particularly among downscale white working class Americans. Kind of skip ahead here, a couple of, on the question of whether America's best days are behind us or not, that kind of optimism question. In 2012, 54% of the country said that America's best days were ahead of us. That number's dropped to 49% last fall, so a fairly big drop. In fact, as many Americans today say America's best days are behind us as say it's ahead of us today. So this is a pretty tough economic climate out there. These numbers are also highly partisan, it might not surprise you since most things in the country are highly partisan. But if you look at the partisan breaks on this, about 6 in 10 Democrats say America's best days are ahead of us. Only 4 in 10 Republicans say America's best days are ahead of us. And if you look at those who identify with the Tea Party, only about 1/3 of them say that America's best days are ahead of us. So kind of strong partisan divide on these questions. The other piece that we've seen that I think is playing a role in the primaries is a kind of not only kind of feeling left behind by economy, but feeling left out. And I think this kind of sense of being disaffected and no one looking out for them is something that's pretty palpable among white working class Americans in particular. And so we had a question that asked about how well the government looked out for different kinds of people. And we were really, I think, shocked to see a couple of things we weren't shocked about. Almost everyone says the government looks out for wealthy people in big business, right? So that's not so shocking that everybody thinks that. But when we asked, and particularly when we looked at some partisan breaks, so we asked about whether the government looks out well for people like you. A majority of Democrats, it's a slim majority, 52%, say the government looks out fairly well for people like them. Republicans, it's only 37% saying the government looks out for people like them. But what's interesting is to compare that number to a couple of other people groups that we asked about directly. So just to give you a sense here, we asked about African Americans and gay and lesbian people as well. How well does the government look out for African Americans? How well does it look out for gay and lesbian people? And I think particularly the Republican numbers here are pretty helpful to kind of understand the anger that we've seen in the primary process so far. So again, among Republicans, only 37% say the government looks out fairly well for people like me. But 73% of them say the government looks out for African Americans, and 73% of them say the government looks out for gay and lesbian people. Right, so there's this kind of gap between saying, okay, it looks out for minorities, whether they're gay and lesbian people, African Americans, but it's not looking out for me. And so I think that is a kind of key dynamic playing into the role. Democrats is actually the opposite. 52% say the government looks pretty well for people like me. Only 38% of them say it looks out for African Americans, and only 46% say it looks out well for gay and lesbian people. So just completely different partisan lenses on this kind of basic question of who the government's looking out for. Another couple of things to kind of talk about is immigrants, the attitudes toward immigrants, attitudes toward Islam and Muslims as well. It's kind of, we've seen a lot of conversation about that in the country. We've seen an uptick in the number of Americans who say that it bothers them when they come into contact with immigrants who mostly don't speak English. In 2012, only 4 in 10 Americans say that this bothered them a lot. That number has jumped 8 percentage points since 2012. It's now 48%. Nearly half of the country says that it bothers them when they come into contact with immigrants who speak little or no English. So that's sort of part of the context here. Most of that has come from white Americans and conservative white Americans. Just to give you one kind of break here on this, if we look at like white college-educated Americans versus white working-class Americans, white college-educated Americans, 57% of them disagree with this statement, but 43% of them agree, but 57% disagree. But if you look at white working-class Americans, nearly 2/3 agree with the statement that it bothers them when they come into contact with immigrants who speak little or no English. So there's that is kind of just part of the landscape we're working on. Also a huge generational divide here. 2/3 of millennials disagree with that statement. A majority of seniors agree with that statement. So the other thing, so that's kind of on immigrants. We're also seeing kind of a backlash around things like affirmative action and race that I kind of hinted to in the other thing. And again, this is, I think it's somewhat about resentment and being sort of left out, left behind. But we had a question where we asked whether you agree or disagree that today discrimination against blacks and other minorities discrimination against whites has become as big a problem as discrimination against blacks and other minorities. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? So only 28% of Democrats agree with that statement. 64% of Republicans agree with that statement. And 68% of those who identify with the Tea Party. Among Americans overall, it's 43%. So it's a minority, but you see these huge partisan divides on this kind of basic question. So when you see things like Black Lives Matter movement and how it's playing on both sides of the kind of the political world, this is part of what's going on there. And then the other thing we've seen is on a couple of questions around Islam. Basically, Americans have been pretty divided. What we basically see in the kind of long term, if you sort of go back to September 2001, around 9/11, you see basically Americans, I would characterize it kind of giving the benefit of the doubt. We had George W. Bush, who was very careful, I think, in his immediate aftermath, making comments about, we're not at war with Islam. He visited a mosque. And I think provided a kind of opening for Americans to take a breath, and who had not really thought about Islam that much, really, to have very little experience there. And then we saw basically Americans being divided, and divided largely along partisan lines and along generational lines. But we did see a 9-point uptick in a question we've been asking about. Do you agree or disagree that the values of Islam are at odds with American values and way of life? The country's been divided on that question, but when we asked it this past fall, it went from 47% in 2013 to 56% agreeing in 2015. Again, most of that movement coming from people identified as Republican, white, conservative Americans who've kind of moved on this question. The other thing I would say, what's interesting though, is that that's not the only, when we ask another question, when we ask, do you agree or disagree that American Muslims are an important part of the US community? About the same number, 57% agree with that question. So we have this kind of ambivalence, I think, in the American public, both saying that American Muslims are an important part and holding some suspicions about Islam and whether it's fully compatible with American democracy and way of life. And I think that's partially why I think kind of leadership on these matters, leadership on these issues matter, because there is some ambivalence, I think, in public opinion here. And one of the main reasons there is ambivalence, I always think this is important to remember when talking about these numbers, is that only 8% of Americans say that they have a conversation with anyone Muslim once a day, and only 29% of them say they even occasionally talk with anyone Muslim. So that means that almost all of their knowledge and perceptions of Islam and Muslims are, in the most literal sense of the word, mediated, right, through the media, through other means, because they just don't have in their everyday lives contact with Muslims. Only 16% of the country say they feel like they know a lot about the beliefs and practices of Muslims. That was another kind of way of kind of knowledge question about it. So that means there's a big vacuum, both in experience and knowledge, that gets filled by the media on all these things. And just one other aside here, when we've asked about media, there are two groups in the country who are more likely than others to say they know a lot about Islam. And those two groups are people who say they get their news mostly from PBS, and the ones who say they get their news mostly from Fox News, right? And those are the two groups who say they are most likely to say they know a lot about Islam. And obviously they have, and when you look at, they have very different views, different conclusions about that based on their media consumption. So I'm going to close with just saying a little bit about the historical context of the election cycle. One of the things we've seen really over the last, say, 3 or 4 election cycles is a fairly stable coalition in terms of how religious groups break in elections. So if we kind of go all the way back to, say, George W. Bush and even 2000, what we basically see is white Christian groups leaning toward Republican candidates for the most part, with white evangelicals being the ones who stick out the most, supporting very steadily, whether it's McCain, George W. Bush, Romney, about 8 and 10 voting for the Republican candidate at the top of the ticket. And then we see this kind of coalition on the other side. Democrats have a much more diverse religious coalition that consists of African-American Protestants, Latino Catholics, and Latino Protestants to a lesser extent, API Americans, religiously unaffiliated Americans, and then this kind of coalition of Jews, Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists, and other non-Christian religions, all tending to lean toward Democratic candidates in the country. So that's kind of one of the kind of interesting dynamics, and one of the reasons why I named the book the way I did is that there has kind of become, since the 80s and since Reagan in particular, this drift, so that you have these kind of white Christian groups supporting the Republican side of the ticket, and kind of non-white Christian groups and other groups supporting the Democratic side of the ticket. Last thing I think I'll say here, just kind of, is the religiously unaffiliated Americans, as I mentioned, are a really important group. They were in the single digits in the 1990s. Today they are 23% of all Americans, right, and more than a third of younger people. So that's a really interesting group to kind of pay attention to. In fact, if we do our typical dividing of the religious world up today, the religiously unaffiliated are actually the largest single religious group in the religious landscape today. They slightly outstrip Catholics to claim the number one place. But we've never quite seen their influence in election years. And the main reason is that even though they have been making up more and more of the general population, they have yet to turn out in large numbers according to their population. So just one thing, take this home. If we look back in 2008, again, when Obama was running, at that time, the unaffiliated made up 17% of the population, but they only made up 12% of voters, right? So they lagged behind by about 5 percentage points. In 2014, they made up 22% of the general population and still made up only 12% of voters. So they've been stuck at 12%. They were 12% of voters in 2014, 12% of voters in 2012, 12% of voters in 2010, and 12% of voters in 2008. So they've yet to kind of crack 12%, despite the fact that their absolute numbers as a percentage of the population are going up. And I think I'll close with, I mentioned this kind of drop in the identification of white Christians in the country. If we just look at Obama, it's kind of interesting, I think, to take the snapshot of just the last president's tenure. Again, so 54% going into his election were identified as white and Christian. Today that number is 45%. And the other thing to kind of remember here that I haven't talked about is I think in terms of like cultural dislocation, I think particularly for many conservative white Christians, it would be hard to overstate the effect of the legalization of same-sex marriage last year in terms of a kind of a cultural eruption. Those groups were typically all in opposing that law. If we can kind of remember, you don't have to go back that far. In 2004, there were more than a dozen states who passed constitutional amendments that George W. Bush rode into re-election on same-sex marriage. And just between that time and today, also public opinion. If you go, when George W. Bush in 2004 was being re-elected, Americans opposed same-sex marriage by a factor of 2 to 1, right? So it wasn't even close. By the time Barack Obama is elected, support is still only about 40% for same-sex marriage. It has jumped to 53% just in the last 8 years. So that's also a kind of big cultural shift to kind of go along with this economic shift and the demographic shift as well. And I think that's part of why we're seeing some of the anxieties that we're seeing in the electorate. And so I'll close with one last number. This is one of my favorite kind of things we've asked about in a while. Because I think it's sort of a Rorschach test to kind of how things are going. So we have a question that says, since the 1950s, do you think American culture and way of life has changed for the better or changed for the worse? And we have found that this question sorts the American electorate very, very strongly. In the country, actually, it's 46% change for the better, 53% change for the worse. So that's where the country is. But if you look, what ends up happening is that basically white working class Americans, white Republicans are all kind of on the kind of side of changing for the worse. Like 62% of white working class Americans say it's changed for the worse. 60% of African Americans say it's changed for the better. So kind of two very different views there. We look at groups like white evangelical Protestants, 72% say it's changed for the worse. But if we look at Jews and other groups that say it's religious minority groups, majority say that it's changed for the better. So I think it's kind of an interesting kind of way of kind of pulling in all the kind of economic, cultural, and demographic changes and kind of what people make of them, and how their perceptions of the country change since that time. So I'll stop there, and we'll see what we want to talk about. So.
Lots of good information. First of all, I'll ask the first question. What do you think is the religious future, the demographic of the United States, given these numbers? I mean, we're looking at millennials. So in 10 to 15 years from now, how is that going to be? What do you see happening?
Yeah. Well, I mean, just a couple things. I think we will see a Catholic church that's majority Latino. Absolutely, that's for sure. We're on the cusp of that right now, and it won't take that much longer if current trends continue for that to take place. In the Protestant world, there's been this kind of ongoing battle where more conservative evangelical leaders, I think, had taken some pleasure in sort of pointing out that it was only the more liberal denominations that were declining, and while the kind of evangelical groups were staying strong, and we're seeing that is no longer really true. Really, since 2007, we've been, particularly if it's that mark, we can measure a very steady drop, not just in kind of mainline Protestants like as Episcopalians and Presbyterians, but also among more evangelical groups like Baptists and Assemblies of God and other Pentecostal groups, also seeing some decline if you're looking at the white membership of those things. So what we're basically seeing, that's largely because both kind of in the Catholic world and the Protestant world, white young people are disaffiliating from Christian churches, and that is a pattern that's kind of true across the board and is driving a lot of these changes.
I feel like that's the partisan part that they don't really buy into, that it's all accepting everything is okay. Why is that not okay? Because the world is becoming, well, it's at their fingertips, social media. They're exposed to so much more. I wonder how that's going to play out in the political arena in terms of, trying to get the religious vote, talking about my faith, where I come from, who I affiliate with, and how that's important for politicians. Because and also the non's not participating and maybe that's a turnoff for them, and that's why they're not participating, or it hasn't changed over to what they are looking for.
Well, it presents a real problem for sure if you're a candidate trying to reach. Younger people are harder to reach anyway, right, and to get active in politics. But it does mean that like a traditional, both Democrats and Republicans, one traditional way of finding people is through churches, right, or through synagogues, or through mosques, right, these kind of religious organizations that are rooted in communities that have natural constituencies that you can sort of then talk to. And when we have younger people who aren't in rates that their parents were affiliated with those organizations, it does present a real dilemma. One of the things I talk about in the book, too, is that we've always seen a correlation in the U.S. context between religious participation and civic participation, right? There's a strong correlation between those two things, so that people who attend religious services, no matter what kind of services they attend, are much more likely to vote. They're much more likely to volunteer in other community organizations. And one real question is like, are we going to see a decline in kind of all kinds of civic participation, or is there going to be some other kind of engine that for this next generation that plays the role that religious congregations play?
I think it's a challenge to religious communities, to listen to those folks and, open, more open. So, and I'll open the floor up for questions. Yes, sir, in the back.
Yeah, is there any evidence that subsequent generation of the immigrants that you cited, the Latinos and the Muslims, that subsequent generations are disaffiliating or staying with their identity and religion?
Yeah, that's a great question. The best data we have are really on Latinos, just because they're large enough to measure reliably in a lot of different surveys. The pattern that we see among Latinos is that, particularly immigration from Mexico, predominantly Catholic, and if we trace them over time, what we tend to see is the second and third generation are less Catholic than the first generation is, and that's sort of an Americanizing effect on them. But what's interesting is that they are actually doing two things. They're becoming, some of them are converting to be Protestants, right? So there's the kind of, that comes some from evangelical proselytization of Catholic immigrants. But there is another group that's actually almost as big that's just becoming nothing, right? So that is kind of, we're seeing that and as they become less Catholic, they're both becoming more evangelical and more unaffiliated over time.
These folks, is there any data for the 65 and older, how they?
The questions that usually get brought up is, so is this a life cycle effect, right?
Yes.
So is it just, always people in their 20s are less affiliated? That's totally true. But even if we take the baby boomer generation and we look at where they were in their 20s, this generation is much more unaffiliated than the baby boomers were even at their level. So what we do see, well, at least historically, we have seen some percentage of, like take the baby boomer generation, their unaffiliated rate drops as they move into their 30s, right? That's because they have kids, they're looking for religious education, they're looking for kind of good ethical grounding, and churches and mosques and synagogues are good places for that to happen, and so they affiliate. And I would imagine that we would see some of that with this generation too, but there's two things that sort of mitigate that, or that I think should make anyone who's counting on that be a little skeptical. And one of them is that even if they return at comparable rates to reaffiliate in the way that they did, they're starting from a much higher level, so they will still be the most unaffiliated generation we've ever seen, even if they return at some rates. The second thing to say is that one of the main draws for returning is that even historically, there have been so few unaffiliated people that typically they married religiously affiliated people, right? So you would have these mixed couples, and it would be that religiously, the one who has religious affiliation that would pull the family to be connected to a congregation. What we're seeing now is there are enough religiously unaffiliated people out there, and they're actually seeking out each other and marrying each other, right? So then there's not the same kind of pull back to a religious congregation that there would be in a relationship where there's one religious spouse and one non-religious spouse. So we'll see, I think, for those two reasons, I would think we're not going to see the kind of return that we've seen in previous generations.
Interesting to see them all around at that time. So, yes, sir.
Hi, I have a question. When you use the word, they're not affiliating with any religious groups, but does that necessarily mean they're not religious, or like if they become atheists? Do you have any data on atheism in America?
Yeah.
They both.
Right, no, it's a great question. So, it's interesting, when you get a group that's as big as almost a quarter of the population, they're obviously not a monolithic group. So this is a new phenomenon. I think we're still, as sociologists, kind of wrapping our heads around this group. The best data that we have, we're going to do a big study actually on this summer, so stay tuned. We'll have more data on this in August. But what we know right now is that as this group has grown, it has become more diverse. If we look at the group that identifies as kind of atheist or agnostic, that kind of claims that label, it's only about a quarter of the unaffiliated group, right? So actually, so that means that like 3/4 of that group is something else. And when we analyze it, we basically just asked a simple follow-up question to kind of help people sort, and we asked them, okay, great, you told us that you don't claim a religion, but do you consider yourself kind of a religious or spiritual person, or do you consider yourself more of a secular or non-religious person? And when we ask a question like that, about another quarter of those unaffiliated group will say, no, actually, I consider myself a religious or a spiritual person, even though I've just told you I don't claim a religion. That group, if you look at them, they have very traditional religious views. They tend to pray fairly often. They still attend church less often than people who claim an affiliation, but they still have some experience of attending congregations. They believe in God at comparable rates to religiously affiliated people, so they look pretty religious. But then there's this kind of middle group that's about half of that unaffiliated group they look demographically like a cross-section of the population, and they just look not interested, right? They're not hardcore anti-religious. They also don't feel a pull to religion. It's just kind of irrelevant to their life, and so that's an interesting group that I think we have got to figure out a little bit more about.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Oh, Diana Eck has observed that, or said that America is the most religiously diverse nation on earth. I'm not sure I agree with that, what is meant when we say diverse. I mean, I think non-Christian religious probably account for far less than just 10% of the population. We're still primarily Christian, even though it's gone down. Other nations such as India, Malaysia, Trinidad, Tobago have a much more equal, much closer in numbers. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on that statement that America is the most religiously diverse nation on earth?
Well, I guess it depends on how you're measuring, right? So you're absolutely right. I was just looking at our numbers here. We're showing if you put all non-Christian people who claim all non-Christian religions together, so Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, Jains, like whatever, they make up only 6% of the country, right? So it's still a fairly small group that as measured on public opinion surveys. So I think it depends on where you're looking. If you're in Boston, as Diana Eck is, or if you're in LA, things look, or in Washington, in the cosmopolitan centers, things look very different. I will say that, I'm from Jackson, Mississippi, which is not what many of you would probably think of as a really religiously diverse place, and for the most part, it's not. Over half the state is Baptist, not just Christian, but Baptist, right? So that way it's homogeneous. But right outside of my hometown, Florence, Mississippi, there is a big Hindu temple going up, right? Right outside of Florence, Mississippi. So just one, yeah, but it's Mississippi, right? So I think it's sort of one of those ways you look at it. But I mean, descriptively speaking, yeah, it's well under 10%, and it tends to be concentrated in more kind of bigger cities. And so if you're in Iowa or Mississippi, you're a little bit less likely to run into it.
Thank you. I have a number of questions, but I'll only ask one, basically. I'm a Sunday school teacher. I have a very difficult time getting the kids to class. Parents don't bring them, or they have other stuff. They're oversubscribed, overcommitted, over whatever it is over there. Could you comment a little bit about the tech revolution and the fact that that takes so much of their time? Jenna knows I live in China part of the year. I see a group, parents, not Chinese, Western parents, 5 with 3 children, sitting in a very nice dumpling place, good eating, like this. There's no conversation. There's no connection at all. And I think that may be also part of the problem, is the teaching and the discipline, so on, which is really seem to be lacking. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Well, there's no doubt. I mean, there's more opportunities, right? More distractions, more places to be involved, I think, with younger people. I'm not sure I'm getting great data on this, unfortunately. I would love to kind of think about, having this data. But the thing that we hear, but in surveys, what's interesting, we asked younger people, so we did have a survey where we said, okay, for younger people, we looked at people who had been raised religious and by their 20s had walked away from it, right? And we asked just that group, right? These people who had a religious affiliation and now say they don't by their 20s. And we said, why did you leave? Well, we had open-ended question, right? They could write in anything they wanted to in the survey. We were kind of shocked that for the most part it wasn't a hard. The answers we got were not like rejectionist kinds of answers. They weren't like I rejected, I've stopped believing. It was mostly things like I'm busy. I've got other things to do. It just doesn't have the pull. It doesn't seem that relevant. But it wasn't like I've stopped believing in God. I think it's all bunk, or science has replaced my belief. It wasn't that kind of stuff. The one thing that did stand out that I'll just throw out here is that when we ask people about, because there's pretty good evidence that you mentioned the politicization of religion, particularly with the Christian right in the 80s and the 90s in the U.S. context. And there is some good evidence that there is some of that is people rejecting the kind of politicization of religion, and that younger people have been really turned off by that, and particularly around the issue of gay rights. So you got to remember that like 7 in 10, or actually it's more like 3/4 of younger people support same-sex marriage, right? And that's just almost all of them. Is a huge number support same-sex marriage. And when we asked them specifically about that, we had about 1/3 of them say that negative teachings about gay and lesbian people were a major factor in their leaving, deciding to leave, about 1/3. So that's clearly played some role.
It's interesting, the 12 to 13% jump too from Obama at the beginning to when legalization happened.
Yeah.
Do you think that plays into what the leadership talking about things that are a bit, the numbers are a bit.
Yeah, I mean, we had Obama
go
saying his
either
thinking
way.
had changed, right? He was the first sitting president to sort of say that. And we had basically the Democratic Party fully move from kind of civil unions to supporting same-sex marriage. They had a major political party, a sitting president, and a generational tidal wave all at the same time. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yes, Dr. Jones, you pointed out that so-called mainline Protestant churches have been declining in their membership over some decades. I was surprised to hear you say, though, that more evangelical and fundamentalist conservative denominations now are experiencing also that decline. I guess it's a twofold question. What are the reasons why the so-called mainline, Episcopal, Lutheran, Methodist, etc., why have they been declining over generations? And then second, why are the more conservative denominations now starting to decline?
Yeah. Well, it's a complicated question, right? For sure. But I mean, one of the more, I think maybe uninteresting, but I think actually one of the key factors here is declining birth rates. And what happened is that as education levels have gone up among white evangelicals, particularly, and the GI Bill played a big role here, that kind of helped predominantly, still today about half of evangelicals are working class, don't have a college degree, but that's higher than it has been in the past. And so one of the things that happened is that mainliners' fertility rates went down earlier than white evangelicals' fertility rates went down, and you combine that with so you have an aging group, and the evangelicals were having more kids and maintaining kind of their kind of replacement rates up really through the 90s and into the 2000s. And as you got, it's absolutely linked to higher education levels. There are more women in the workforce, those kinds of things, and it's in some ways kind of pragmatic result of lower fertility rates. And then you combine that with a kind of push-off by a younger generation that's been, I think, very wary of kind of politicized religion at the same time. And it's the combination of those two things that sort of is pulling away. But you can see, I'm glad to hear you're surprised. It hasn't gotten a lot of news. It's one of the things in the book that I work very hard to establish, because it hasn't been a kind of known talking point, that the more conservative white and I should say, be careful to say this, more the conservative white denominations that are declining, right? Because the Latino API congregations are growing, but it really is the white congregations and predominantly white denominations like Southern Baptists. Southern Baptists are the largest denomination in the country, bar none, and they have seen their numbers. If you look at from 2007, it's a great chart in the book about growth rates, but from 2007 to the present, they've gone from kind of flat growth rates into negative growth rates just since 2007. And I think that's a pretty good bellwether.
Now, have people like Tony Perkins figured this out?
You know, I don't know. Well, it's a little bit of a dilemma, right? So, you know, if your livelihood depends on being at the head of a big block of people, you don't want to talk about them getting smaller. But, yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dieter Detke, Georgetown University. Thank you for a extremely data-rich presentation, and
you.
your reading of the data is just great, and supports the notion that America is moving into the direction of a majority-minority country and society. And I just wanted to add one point of difficulty, which is it's going to make American pluralism, working pluralism, very, very difficult. And I'm a little bit afraid of this, and it's happening in Europe too. And not to mention the term polarization, which you didn't, but you know, that's what we have too. But my question is, the hard question, so to speak, you didn't mention the term middle class, American middle class, which is a key component of democratic stability, right? That's what we think.
Yeah.
And America used to be 70% middle class, is that right? The numbers that I saw is under 50% now. Again, something that has dramatic consequences for democratic stability too. If you do have, you talked about the alienation of the white working class, but if that is a larger group beyond the white working class, then you got into trouble with democratic stability. And I see some cultural democratic difficulties in Europe and some economic, social economic difficulties here coming up, you know, potentially ending in polarization. So if it's a question,
Yeah.
thank you for trying to to tackle it.
Thank you for that. I think the two things that hold your 2 points together are, or where is there sort of the stability, right, from which to negotiate some of these big changes? Because I do think this is one of the big challenges that we face, and I think why I think like Donald Trump has been very successful right here is he's trading on a lot of anxieties I think that are out there in the country, and I think it's one thing, as you say, if you're a stable and secure kind of white Christian culture, it's one thing to kind of welcome other people that you don't see as a threat. But if you see yourself kind of becoming a minority and are really worried about that, that leaves you in a much less secure place to be generous, to be welcoming, to be, you know, all the kind of other things to think about. And I think the same thing is true for the middle class. You're absolutely right. The middle class has been shrinking and thinning out. We are seeing, I mean, for a long time it was kind of a truism in survey work that that people would tell you they were middle class even if they really weren't by any objective measure. They would just kind of, because it's an aspirational label. And we're actually finding, and we've kept asking the question, we're actually finding more Americans willing to say, no, actually I'm not middle class, I'm working class, in more recent surveys, because I think they're just realizing, you know, it's not realistic for me to kind of keep making this claim when I'm having trouble making ends meet every month and it's just not working. The other thing to say is, like, you know, manufacturing jobs, right, in the country that could provide a kind of basis for even people without a college degree to be middle class have, you know, dropped by over a third just since 2000 in the country. They were already dropping, but even if you go from 2000 to the present, just the sheer number of manufacturing jobs have dropped by about a third. And even the ones that remain have seen their wages decline in terms of real dollars over that time. So, you know, the idea of trying to put together a middle-class family life with 2 factory jobs is just less and less possible in the country.
And is this something that we're going to be looking at for the next 10 to 15 years? Is the millennial, are they going to change that? You know, and that goes to the, sorry, I was saying that, is it going to maybe change in the next 10 to 15 years with the millennials this idea because of the middle class. Because where are they going to be at? Are they going to be working factory jobs? And I think this goes to how do we define the American dream? You know, we say with maybe some of these numbers, is religion dead or going in that direction? No, it's just, you know, we've got a different group of folks that have different ideas. Their minds are, you know, open to the world. And so, you know, I think our country has been able to roll with these changes in previous generations. But what are your thoughts on those?
Well, I think, you know, it's interesting that the millennial generation right now is not an optimistic generation. I mean, the surveys that we're looking at, I mean, they're pessimistic. I mean, they're getting, you know, they did what they were supposed to do. They, you know, they went to college at higher rates than their parents did, and they're getting out and they're finding they're going to be interns for 2 years, you know, before they can find a real job. And so I think that's a pretty tough situation. They're pretty pessimistic. In fact, they say that they think their parents are going to be better off than they are. And so I think that's a pretty tough, you know, generation to kind of work with.
To get involved.
Yeah, and millennial men, millennial white men in particular, are really angry right now. They feel like they played by the rules. They feel like they tried to sort of, you know, do right by all things after them, and then they're not finding the right opportunity. They're seeing other, and I think the real resentment there is a real challenge. Yeah.
That's why looking to the youth and the younger generation is always a good, you know, to do. All right. Is there one last? Did you get to ask? I'll let this gentleman ask. Since, yes, please.
I have a question about the Republican primary.
Yeah.
Donald Trump is.
We finally get to a Republican primary question. All right, it's been very polite. Everyone, yeah.
Donald Trump is popular among white working class, and also he is popular among white evangelical. Some of evangelical leaders, including Jerry Falwell Jr., expressed their support to Trump. But many of his policy is not conservative, and his character and his lifestyle is completely different from evangelical moral standard. So could you tell why Trump attracts many evangelical voters?
Yeah. You know, it is the question, right, of the primaries. I mean, you know, because if you go back to and you listen to the fall, and Ted Cruz's campaign strategy was all about Super Tuesday, which is heavily Southern, right? He was going to sweep the Southern states. He was going to kind of turn out all these extra evangelical voters. I mean, that was his entire campaign strategy to begin with, and it turned out that Donald Trump swept on the whole South, pretty much. And Trump has won from Michigan to Mississippi, you know, among white evangelicals. And so what's going on? So I wrote a piece 3 weeks ago now in the Atlantic trying to figure this out. And basically what I concluded was that Trump has managed to convert what we might have called in the past values voters. That's kind of the term that got wrapped around evangelicals in the 2004 election. Into what I'm calling nostalgia voters, right? And that appeal has been a more powerful appeal. It's the reason I say that is a lot because of the data we've already seen here, right? 7 to 10 evangelicals say things have become worse since the 1950s. They strongly oppose same-sex marriage, which is now the law of the land. They have high anxieties about Islam, high anxieties about think immigrants are a burden on the country. So these are all talking points, right, for Donald Trump. And I think his appeal to the most important word I think Donald Trump has uttered is the word again. Out of all the stuff he said, that make America great again, right, is the most important piece of his slogan. And so I think if you're looking at a group of people who feel like their economic, cultural, and religious world is passing from the scene, and you tell them, I'm going to restore power to the Christian churches, I'm going to prevent ISIS from beheading Christians in the Middle East, and I'm going to make America great again, and hey, I may not be one of you, but I'll be a friend of yours in the White House. I mean, I think that's a pretty powerful appeal, and it's turned out to be more powerful than Ted Cruz, who's really been using a lot of the traditional talking points that you would use to reach evangelicals. But he hasn't been able to get the kind of traction that Trump has. I think the difference is that, you know, Cruz in many ways he's talking about religious exemptions and religious liberty, and these are kind of in many ways like respectable retreat strategies, right, for a group that lost a culture war. But Trump is saying, I'm going to turn the tide and I'm going to turn back the clock. And that's I think, a much more powerful appeal.
Thank you, Dr. Jones.
Yep.
And we'll conclude. Thank you so much.